So we're really sort of honored today to have our speaker, Dr. or Professor Miya Carey. Miya has been at Binghamton now this is her second year, I believe. She got her PhD from Rutgers University. Excuse me here. Anyhow, she is, the full title is a presidential postdoc. It's a presidential diversity postdoctoral fellow. She's been at Binghamton for 2 years. And the really terrific thing is that as of this next fall, she will be formally in the history department as a regular assistant professor. So we're hoping to have her here for many, many years. Her research has been particularly on young women, girls in the DC area, a whole variety of things. And today she's going to be talking about one aspect of that, which I think is totally fascinating. Her title as given to us was A Force for Desegregation, Girl Scouting and the Civil Rights Movement. So Miya, welcome. We're delighted to have you here, and it's all yours.
Thank you, John. Again, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Whenever I talk about the Girl Scouts, I always like to start off by asking people if they were a Girl Scout or a Boy Scout, or if you just like the cookies. But has anyone here been involved in Scouting when they were younger? Okay. Oh, great. It's like half of you guys. Awesome. Yes. Yeah, so I hope that you guys enjoy this talk. I'm going to share my screen, and my title changed a bit, but it's going to be the same topic, but I decided to just tweak the title. Okay, so the title is Bigger Than a Trefoil, Black Women, Girl Scouting, and Civil Rights. So again, as you can see from the title, today we'll be talking about Black women in the Girl Scouts and their connection to the Civil Rights Movement. And specifically, we're going to talk about Black women in Washington, D.C.'s Girl Scout Council and their push for inclusion of Black Scouts, and then the eventual desegregation of the council. So the time period that we're looking at is roughly like 1934 to 1957. So really like the early part of the Civil Rights Movement. So the title of my presentation, Bigger Than a Trefoil, is inspired by civil rights activist Ella Baker. I'm not sure if people have heard of Ella Baker. I don't think she's as well known as she should be. She was born in North Carolina, and she worked largely behind the scenes, but she was instrumental in the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. And she also worked with the Southern Leadership Christian Conference, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I got the acronym mixed up, or the SCLC, which people largely associate with Martin Luther King, as well as the NAACP. So she was like really instrumental behind the scenes. And I urge you that if you don't know a lot about her, to learn more about Ella Baker. In a brief essay, Baker argued that the sit-ins and the protests of the 1960s, so the activists sitting at lunch counters, for example, were concerned with, quote, something much bigger than a hamburger or even a giant-sized Coke, end quote. Now, for those of you not familiar, the trefoil is both the symbol of the Girl Scouts, and it's also the name of one of their cookies. It's like their shortbread cookie that they sell. So that's where the title comes from. So following this line of Baker's point about the sit-in being more than just about getting a hamburger, Black women who advocated for Scouting were concerned with much more than just giving their girls an after-school activity and like earning badges. I argue that there was much more at stake, and we'll talk about that later, about why Black women found Scouting so important to bring to Black girls. So to give a little bit of background, the Girl Scouts was founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1912 by Juliette Gordon Lowe. She was a wealthy, white widowed socialite. She sought to create an organization for all girls, something that the organization continues to strive for today. Now, it did not take long for the question of whether Black girls were included in, the all, and whether they could join or if there would be integrated activities. So kind of a darker part of the Girl Scouts past. In response to the question of Black Scouts, Lowe stated that Black children, quote, can and do corrupt other children, end quote. Lowe eventually decided that she kind of like punted the ball. And she eventually decided that it would be up to local councils to decide whether they would recognize Black troops and have activities such as interracial camping. And this would be the racial policy of the Girl Scouts of the USA, so the national organization, for at least the first half of the 20th century. So again, for those who aren't familiar with the organization, it's very decentralized in structure, where you have the national organization at the top, and then you have these local councils that govern the troops. So basically, because of this decentralized structure, although you had the national organization saying, Girl Scouting is for everyone, it was really up to the local councils to decide who they would include. So in 1913, 1 year after the founding of the Girl Scouts, the Washington, D.C. Council was established. And today it's known as the Girl Scout Council of the nation's capital, or the GSCNC. But for brevity, because that's kind of a mouthful, I'll just refer to it as the D.C. Council or the Washington Council. Okay, so again, as I just said, Scouting comes to DC in 1913, but it wasn't until 1934, so just over 20 years, that Black troops were officially recognized by the DC Council. Prior to that, or prior to 1934, Black women in DC and nearby Maryland had been organizing on a smaller scale. And I'm gonna unshare and then share again. There's a council map that I want to show, and the map isn't dated, so we can kind of do like a little bit of detective work here. All right, how do I make this bigger? Okay, so this is, hopefully that's big enough. This is a map of the DC Council. So as you can see here, the shape of the district, you have Virginia off to the left. As you can see here, the council is broken up into different districts. Basically, districts were like the different neighborhoods. And as you can see here, it gives a listing of like the different troops in each district. So you have district 1 through 5, and then you have colored. So although this map isn't dated, I think it's from before 1934, when Black troops are like officially folded into the council. And that's because they're not given a district, it's just shown as colored. So here we see that the council was aware that these Black troops were forming, but they weren't necessarily like really part of the fold prior to 1934. So I just wanted to show that, just because I think it'll kind of give you a sense of like where we're looking. And the districts, like the different districts kind of become important in this story. All right. Okay. All right, so how exactly did Black Washingtonians get involved in scouting, and why did their recognition happen when it did? So in 1933, the DC Council noted that it had received a growing number of inquiries regarding the formation of Black Girl Scout troops. That same year, John Aubrey Davis, who was a student activist at Howard University, which is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C., formed an organization known as the New Negro Alliance, or the NNA. So the NNA is kind of known for their Don't Buy Where You Work campaigns. So basically with these campaigns, it urged Black citizens to not, patronize or to buy from businesses that did not hire Black people. Hence, don't buy where you can't work. So it was a boycott movement. So these campaigns and other campaigns of the New Negro Alliance challenged the more conservative tactics of old guard organizations like the NAACP. And it signaled the growing visibility of a younger, more militant generation of activists in the nation's capital. So you're probably thinking, what does the NNA have to do with the Girl Scouts? And I would say that even though Black women who would go on to become the early council members and troop leaders in DC, such as Virginia McGuire, who we'll talk about later, although they may not have been in the same political circles or believed in the same strategies for achieving civil rights, I believe that these women didn't exist in a vacuum. And it's likely that the more militant form of protest emboldened them to ask for inclusion in the Girl Scouting organization. Now, of course, there's no, there's no historical record that shows there was conversations between these women and the NNA, but, as a historian, you can kind of make informed guesses. And I believe that they were aware of what Davis was doing, and I think it could have emboldened them. So in response to the growing inquiries about Black troops, the DC Council established a committee on colored troops to work with local Black institutions, such as the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, as well as Girl Scout councils in other cities, so like New York, for example, to investigate and understand how they might bring Black Scouts into the fold. So one of these large questions about, recognizing these Black troops is, what are we going to do about camping? And to kind of save time, we can talk, if we have time to ask questions later on about why camping becomes this really contested issue. So white leaders within the DC Council often cited the lack of volunteers and financial support as the reason for not allowing certain troops to organize. But some African Americans believed that the white leadership was simply hostile towards the formation of Black troops. Now, I would argue that this hostility was rooted in the notion that Black girls were not deserving of participation in the program. And we'll talk a bit about that later too. In 1934, 1 year after the Committee on Colored Troops released a report of its findings, the DC Council sanctioned the creation of Black troops in a grouping known as District 7. So if you remember that map that I showed you with the different districts, districts are based upon neighborhood. However, when Black troops are formally recognized, no matter where these Black troops formed in the city, they were automatically part of District 7. So they were invited to join the council, but it was on a segregated basis. I just wanted to emphasize that. And this is just a picture that I really love. This is a Brownie troop around 1955. So I just wanted to share that. Okay. So 1934, again, the council says, okay, Black troops can form, and they're part of this District 7. So Virginia McGuire was tapped to lead District 7. Now, McGuire is a really interesting woman in DC. She comes from a very well-to-do family, very well educated. Her family, the McGuire family, also owns a funeral home, which is actually still in business today. So a really prominent DC family. Now, before becoming involved in scouting, McGuire was a president of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the NAACP. And in her tenure as the president of the NAACP, the DC chapter, she spearheaded these anti-lynching demonstrations. And she was also a director of the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, which was like the Black YWCA in the city of Washington. And again, she was a well-connected, prominent member of DC society. And I wanted to highlight McGuire's background here because I want us to think about the blending of the political and the social, particularly in the lives of Black women. Access to something like leisure was a civil rights issue in the same way, restrictive covenants or lynching were. And they're often not seen as civil rights issues, but leisure was a very contested place during the civil rights movement. So McGuire accepted her position with the Scouts only after the council agreed to offer Black girls the same program as their white counterparts. The troops were segregated, and while there were some council-wide activities that included troops of both races, Black and white Scouts did not camp together. And again, McGuire and this early group of Black women leaders within the DC Council, they were more concerned with having access to the program than desegregating the program in the 1930s. And this could partially be because of the time period, the 1930s, but they also may not have seen any value in desegregating the Girl Scouts. And again, we can talk more later in our discussion about how integration, although we often see that as the goal of the civil rights movement, for some activists, integration wasn't really the ultimate goal. So in a 1948 newspaper article, McGuire said that the purpose of bringing scouting to Black girls was to give them, quote, a program in which they could develop morally, physically, and spiritually as young women, end quote. Now, this is where we get to, I mentioned earlier about what's at stake and why was it so important for Black girls to have access to scouting. How was it, quote, bigger than a trefoil? I want us to think again about that Juliette Gordon Low quote that I showed you earlier, where she says how Black children can and do corrupt other children. Now, ideas about childhood and childhood innocence have been and continue to be deeply racialized. Speaking more broadly, the idea that children are blank slates in need of nurturing and that childhood is a separate life stage from adulthood is fairly modern. And when I say fairly modern, I mean established by the 19th century. However, Black children were completely excluded from these protections that come with the identity of being a child. They were not considered innocent or in need of nurturing or protection. And when I say they weren't considered innocent, you can see this in different policies. You can see that social policies or legal policies. We can see this in the juvenile justice system in the past as well as today. And for Black girls in particular, they were often viewed as adults, with the onset of puberty. However, Black women like Virginia McGuire refused to see Black girls in these racist terms. They recognized that they too needed to be nurtured and developed, and they sought to prolong Black girls' childhoods. In essence, they challenged the ways that American society kind of like worked Black girls' stages of development. So women like McGuire recognized Black girls as children, even though larger society didn't. So now we're going to get into like how we go from, okay, we're happy to join, it doesn't need to be desegregated, to 20 years later, this push to desegregate the Scouts in DC. So by 1955, Black involvement in DC scouting grew, and it grew so large that District 7, which again is the Black district, had to be divided into two parts, District 7 East and District 7 West. By 1955, Black women in the DC Council were no longer content with simply access to the program, but like, why now? Why in 1955? And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. On the national level, we have the 1954 Brown v. Board decision, which ruled that separate is inherently unequal and declared that the segregation of schools was unconstitutional. That's what's happening at the national level. On the local level, desegregation of public accommodations, so something like restaurants, and residential segregation was starting to crumble. So basically, everything around the Girl Scouts is starting to desegregate. Now, the official desegregation of the DC Council, I would say it began in 1955 with the desegregation of its flagship overnight camp, which was called Camp Mayflower. And then 2 years later in 1957, the District 7 is no more. So Black troops aren't, segregated into a separate district. Now, the desegregation of the DC Council was not inevitable. And in fact, the leaders of District 7 had been raising money to build a camp for its Black Scouts up until the desegregation of Camp Mayflower in 1955. So again, in December 1954, 7 months after the Brown v. Board ruling, the Council's Committee on Established Camping recommended that the council should desegregate its camps, including its flagship, Mayflower, which is pictured here, and it's in Virginia. So Alma Jackson, in this picture here, she's on the right side with the glasses. Alma Jackson, who was a Black troop leader and council member, remembered that the discussions about desegregating Mayflower, quote, were hot, end quote. Those who were hesitant argued that they worried about how the camp's neighbors would react. And there had been instances in the past, where not in Washington in particular, but in other places in the country, where there was hostility towards Black campers and Black troop leaders, particularly if they were, in the same space as white scouts and leaders. So the board debated for weeks, and when it voted on the issue 1 month later, the board voted to desegregate the camp. The desegregation of Mayflower, though important, did not signal racial harmony in DC's Girl Scout Council. Although the desegregation process appeared to be smooth, there was backlash in at least one of the day camps. So for example, there was this camp called Plato Place, Plato, which was a day camp in Forestville, Maryland. And while the proposal to integrate day camping at Plato Place passed in January 1957, there were a couple of districts within the council that objected to this day camp being desegregated. And mind you, again, this is 2 years after their flagship camp has been desegregated. Instead, they suggested that Black Scouts could camp on separate days. The members of District 7 were so distressed at the thought of segregated camping that they threatened to withdraw from the lucrative annual cookie sale. So those of you, I saw a lot of you were involved in Girl Scouts when you were younger. Like, as you know, the cookie sale, it creates a lot of revenue for the organization. And that's where, a lot of money that they make is based in this cookie sale. So the fact that these Black women were threatening to essentially go on strike and withdraw from the cookie sale, it would have been a devastating blow to the council's finances. Ultimately, however, the camp committee sided with District 7, and they voted that Plato Place had to desegregate. So I have here, it's a picture of a group of integrated campers in 1957 at Plato Place. So the dissolution of District 7 in 1957 meant that the Girl Scout Council of the nation's capital was no longer segregated. at least technically, but girls could join whichever troop was closest to their home. However, because troops formed in schools and churches and community centers, they most likely remained composed mostly of one race. And it's also important to note that Washington at this time, by 1957, had become a majority Black city. So you had, like white flight out into the suburbs. So since we're talking about integration, I also wanted to highlight Ethel G Harvey, who was a really important member of the DC Council. She began her career with the Girl Scouts in 1943, where she started a brownie troop at her church. And in 1972, she was elected the first Black president of the DC Council. And in fact, she was the first Black president of any Girl Scout council in the United States. So I just wanted to highlight her and that really important achievement. So to conclude, I want to bring us back to Ella Baker. So in an essay called Developing Community Leadership, Ella Baker, who here is, she has on the hat and she's speaking to the microphone. And I believe that that's actually Ruby Dee that's seated next to her, the actress. Ella Baker states that the civil rights movement, quote, was carried largely by women, end quote. And in 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. called the Girl Scouts a force for desegregation. Now, he said this in response to the formation of an interracial troop in Kentucky. So again, although I think a lot of people don't really connect the Girl Scouts to the larger civil rights movement, I think that they should be part of that history. Although women like Virginia McGuire, Ethel Harvey, and Alma Jackson aren't names that we think of when we think of the movement, and organizations like the Girl Scouts aren't talked about when we discuss different sites of civil rights struggle, I hope that today I showed how Black women were truly part of every phase of the movement, and that it expands who we think of as activists and what we consider civil rights work. And in addition, I also want to add that the fight for Black girls to be recognized as children continues. I'm not sure if people saw this in the news, but just about 2 weeks ago in Rochester, New York, a 9-year-old Black girl who was in distress, I believe her mother might have called the police. She was told by arresting officers at the scene that she was acting like a child. They told the 9-year-old that she was acting like a child, and then they pepper sprayed her. Now, according to the Washington Post and reports by organizations such as the African American Policy Forum, and if we look at research by scholars such as Monique Morris, adults, quote, view Black girls as young as 5 as less innocent and more adult than white girls of the same age and needing less protection and nurturing, end quote. And I got that from the Washington Post. Black girls are also subject to harsher punishments in schools than their white counterparts. And this is known as adultification bias. Now, my goal isn't to end on a sad or depressing note, but to really highlight the historical importance of, and to really see what was at stake in the work of Black women in the Girl Scouts. And to forge connections between the past and the present. And I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts and if you have any questions. Thank you again for taking the time to listen.